Thank you, Brian. Good morning. Andy thought my attempt at green was rather weak. He made sure I knew that before the service started today. I realized I don't have a lot of green. The other thing he thought I should do, because I'm Irish, my father's Irish, my mother's Italian, so it's a struggle between red wine and Guinness, and it's a daily struggle. Which one to pick? Not either one. What? And. It's an and/or, okay. And so he thought it'd be a good idea if I did the entire sermon with an Irish accent. Who's in? I realized the only really green shirt I own, Jeff Clipmus gave me. It's from a butcher in Minnesota, and on the back it says, "If it doesn't squeal, it's not a meal." And I just wasn't sure if I should wear that up front. I know I've taken this church to a different place the last 2.5 years, but that may be farther than you really want to go. Amen? If it doesn't squeal, it's not a meal. If you have a Bible, open up to the book of Luke. If you don't have a Bible, there's a bunch of Bibles in the chairs in front of you. Slightly different translation than mine, but you'll be able to follow along. Excuse me, I'll do my best not to do that this morning. We have 6 studies left, and I'll be here for 6 weeks of those 6 studies. And then we will start an 11-week deal together with a bunch of speakers, some of which I'm flying in. I'm very excited about. But we have 6 weeks to go on this study in Luke that we've been in for well over a year. So let's start. In chapter 22, verse 53, it says, "While I was with you daily in the temple," this is Jesus speaking, "you did not lay hands on me. But this hour and the power of darkness is yours." Jesus calls it this hour and the power of darkness. Think about that. Jesus had just entered into Jerusalem on a colt, an unridden colt that only a king would do. He has presented himself just days before to Jerusalem, and in particular to the Jewish leadership, as the king of Israel. And not just a king, not just the next king. This is the king that David foreshadowed. This is the new millennial king. This is the final king of Israel and the world. Jesus has presented himself in such a way to reign forever in his millennial kingdom. He then marches up the southern steps of the temple. He judges the Jewish leadership and lets them know that his Father is all done with their leadership. And he essentially takes the temple back for God. This is the time in history. This is the day in history. This is the hour in history that all of life has been waiting for. When the Divine One, the Son of God, the Messiah, would take his throne. It's also the day Satan knows if Messiah wins, he loses grip on the ground on which he rules. So for Satan, it is also the day. And he's not so stupid. Ryan so eloquently taught this when he taught the triumphal entry a month or so ago. He's not so dumb as to think he's going to kill God off. He knows God. He's stood in the presence of God. He knows God is a Trinity. He knows there's 3 of them in one, if you will. He's not so dumb as to think he's going to destroy Messiah. His goal is to rid Messiah from the earth on which he rules. And if he can get Messiah off the earth, then he can roam freely in this world. The great irony in all of this is that the Jewish leadership thinks that they're acting on behalf of God, and yet, according to Jesus, it's their hour of darkness, which is a chilling thought, I think, for all of us to think through. Thinking what they're doing is actually on behalf of God, when it's actually on behalf of his arch enemy. But this is God's specialty. This is what God just does beautifully. He steps into the crud, and somehow God makes gold out of these situations. And Luke's narrative is going to present us with 4 different scenes in this trial, which is what we'll be covering this morning. The actual trial scene of Jesus. We'll talk briefly about when that might have taken place. Jeremy covered last week the first piece of the trial, which is the hearing before the Sanhedrin, this group of Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes. They're in this collective kind of 70-person body that rules over Israel, if you will. And so Jesus has already been brought before the Sanhedrin, and this morning we will cover Jesus then being brought before Pilate on a couple of occasions, then being ushered over to Herod, and then finally being sentenced. The single constant that Luke never wants us, by the way, don't be distracted by this. We're having a problem. It's not that Peter's back there going, I'm going to mess with him. It doesn't squeal, it's not a meal. It's just going to go up and down, and it's really the glory of God shining on me. The single constant that Luke is driving home in this passion narrative, in this final week, is that it is the Jewish leadership that is pulling the strings. And it's very important that we not miss that. Everybody had a hand in Jesus' death, but it's the Jewish leadership Luke wants us to know that we're really actually moving this thing around. In fact, in verse 23 of chapter 23, it says, the Sanhedrin's voices prevail. It's their collective voice together against Jesus that prevails. Let's begin our passage on the trials in chapter 23 of Luke in verse 1. Then the whole body, that means the whole body of the Sanhedrin, the whole body of them got up and brought Jesus before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation, for forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Messiah, a king. So Pilate asked him, saying, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus answered him and said, it is as you say. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, more than likely when it says the chief priests and the crowds, it's actually the Sanhedrin guard. It's the guard that worked for the Sanhedrin. I find no fault in this man. But they kept on insisting, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place. Now, just a side note, and I'm going to have several side notes because they're fascinating to me with the text. Not critical to the main point we're going to be getting to this morning, but they're the color, if you will, of this. As a side note, it's not my intent to map out the exact chronology of this final week. And the Gospels leave some room for what took place. I do want to highlight for us this morning that we generally hear that these trials all took place in a matter of a few hours in the middle of the night, sometime like late Thursday, early Friday morning. And that is definitely a possibility. The Sanhedrin, they were afraid of riding before the Sabbath and before Passover. The Romans were extremely scared of riding. And so there is a slight possibility, I think, that these trials took place in a matter of hours. There is another option, though, that is a possibility and one that I tend to buy into more. Because the problem is, if the trials are all squeezed into just a matter of a couple of hours, a few hours, it actually means that the Jewish leadership broke all kinds of laws that they would have never broken. First of all, the Jewish law forbade any kind of capital proceeding to take place at night. This is a capital crime they're accusing Jesus of, worthy of death. And we'll talk about why that is in a minute, although Jeremy mentioned it last week. So, first of all, they were not allowed to do a capital proceeding late at night. It also assumes that none of the Sanhedrin, these 70 guys, none of them had anything better to do, thank you, brother, had anything better to do in the middle of the night but to get up and to try Jesus right before Passover and on the eve of the Sabbath. And that somehow Pilate and Herod, these rulers, if you will, have nothing better to do in the middle of the night than to get up and be involved in this somehow kangaroo court for a guy basically they don't even respect. On top of that, neither one of them had ever met Jesus, and I would go so far as to say I don't think Pilate has even ever heard of Jesus. So these two in royal positions, who should be asleep in the middle of the night, would have had to have been roused in the middle of the night for this kangaroo court. It doesn't make much sense to me. During a time, by the way, in Roman history, where crucifixions were a dime a dozen. thousands upon thousands of Jews were crucified. I mean, in this scene, we have two other people being crucified at the same time. By the way, there might have been more. It's just that the Gospels don't have a need to highlight those. And on top of that, and this is the funny one to me, if you've ever been to the Middle East, doing things quickly is not like a strong suit. If you've been anywhere in the Middle East, they've got one gear and it's called granny. It just moves, everything moves slowly. It drives you crazy. So the thought that this would all take place that quickly is a little far-fetched to me. The timing that I kind of buy into is that there were two Passovers, and one was a group of people celebrated it on the sun, another group celebrated it on the lunar calendar, and so Jesus would have entered into Jerusalem on a Sunday. He would have taught in the temple till Wednesday. He would have celebrated the lunar Passover on Wednesday night, and then arrested in the middle of the night Wednesday and into Thursday, and then all day Thursday these trials take place until we get into Friday and the actual execution and the sun calendar's version of the Passover, so that Jesus could die on that particular day. And that would be more consistent with Jewish law. The Gospels leave this open, so it doesn't matter what you think or what I think, because it's really not completely clear. I share all that only because some of you think more from a skeptic standpoint, and if you're like my wife, you like things exactly stated, and you want it exactly clear, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so if that's the case, I give you at least another option to think through as you read the Gospels. Caiaphas, the high priest, has just accused Jesus before the Sanhedrin of blasphemy. But Rome actually holds the power to execute, not the Sanhedrin. Thus, Jesus is sent to the Roman representative, if you will, in Pilate. Another side note, this doesn't mean that when it says the whole body of the Sanhedrin, that every one of them were against Jesus. As we'll find out when Jesus is crucified, there's a couple of dudes in the Sanhedrin that are willing to lose everything they have on Jesus' behalf. So even though the whole Sanhedrin has been judged and God is going to remove them as his leaders, there's actually dudes within the Sanhedrin that actually believe Jesus is the Messiah, which is a really cool thing to me. Where is Pilate when they bring Jesus? There's a couple of options. One option is that Jesus is brought to Pilate at the Antonia Fortress. There's a couple of slides. This is a really neat deal in Jerusalem. They literally built a model of the old city of Jerusalem. You can see people in the background, so it gives you a sense of scale. You can literally walk around this model and see what it was like on the day of Jesus. So that big square structure in the back is, of course, the Temple Mount, with the thing in the middle, obviously being the sanctuary. We already talked about Solomon's portico on the right. That four-pronged thing on the left, that is Antonia Fortress. Next slide. And as you can see, it is higher than the Temple Mount. The reason for this is that way you can be in the Antonia Fortress and see what's going on inside the Temple Mount to make sure the Jews are behaving properly. And this was built some 50 years before Jesus by Herod the Great. So there's a possibility that Jesus is brought there. Although more than likely, I think the better option is that Jesus is actually brought to Herod the Great's palace, and that Pilate is residing there. So this is, again, you'll see the Temple Mount on the upper left. This is approximately where Herod's palace would be brought, and you can see the size of this thing. It's about the size of the Temple Mount. Next slide. It is huge. This is what Herod the Great built for himself. Pilate normally would reside in the Mediterranean Sea, and Herod's also his other palace known as Caesarea. But he actually comes to this palace. It is 435,000 square feet. It is massive. It's on the western side of the city, which is today known as the Armenian Quarter, just past the Jaffa Gate, if you've been there or are familiar with it. That was for Tom's mom, by the way. This palace had two wings, you can see them on each side, with baths and halls and accommodations for hundreds of guests. Groves of trees and canals and ponds studded with bronze fountains. Each side had a name. One side was named Agrippa. The other side was named Caesar. And in the middle of the palace were gardens and porticos. And both buildings would have housed Praetorian guards. So Jesus would have been more than likely brought to one of these two palaces within this whole temple complex. Can you imagine Jesus the Galilean in his tattered robes coming to this palace? The contrast should just smack you in the face between Jesus and Pilate. Jesus at one point had said of himself, "The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." And Pilate is living in opulence in this palace. One seemingly with no authority whatsoever, holding really all of the cards. The other one with no authority, looking like he has the power. Pilate was mentioned earlier in the book of Luke as having executed a bunch of Galilean pilgrims that had come to Jerusalem. So we know just from that he's not a good dude. We also know from Josephus he was a horrible, horrible guy. In fact, Rome got tired of him and removed him shortly after Jesus died. Jesus had also predicted that he would be handed over to the Gentiles, particularly when he was in Jericho, ready to come up for the Passion narrative. And so Jesus now, having been given by the Sanhedrin over to Pilate, is fulfilling his own prophecy. Isn't this a crack-up? Jesus is being called a blasphemer and a false prophet while he's fulfilling the prophecies. I love that Jeremy talked about that last week. He was so articulate in this. Jesus is fulfilling the very thing they're doing as they're calling him not a prophet. The charge against Jesus is that he's trying to upset a very delicate balance. The Romans believed that the divine sanction of the gods actually brought peace about. And so Jesus is actually on the thrust of upsetting this delicate balance. How can Jesus be God if he's upsetting the peace of Rome? And so there's this manipulation going on in the background. And the charge, grammatically, is really only one charge against Jesus. The charge is, we found this man perverting our nation, the Jewish leadership is saying. The other two comments that come after this are really an elaboration of that one charge. And they are, he's forbidding our people to pay the Roman annual tax, which means that he does not acknowledge the Roman leadership and the Roman rule. And he's also claiming to be Messiah, and they toss the title of king in just to upset Pilate even more. He's claiming to be Messiah and a king, which is usurping Caesar, which is not a real smart thing to do. This word perverting, we found this man perverting our nation. It's not a light word, and Jeremy really hit this last week. It literally means to lead astray as a false prophet. Deuteronomy 13 in the Torah makes it clear that this is a capital offense and worthy of execution if you're a false prophet. It means that Jesus was not appointed by God. It means that Jesus is not speaking for God. It means that when Jesus went to the Temple Mount and judged the Jewish leadership, that he was actually working against God. But of course, Pilate, it's a little like that Far Side, you know the Far Side with the dogs? What do they hear? Blah, 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 rover. Blah, 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 rover. It's a little like that for Pilate. All Pilate is hearing is, this is going to cause unrest. Pilate has one goal. He wants to somehow make it through this Jewish holiday without a problem and get back to the Mediterranean where he can relax by the ocean. Pilate wants his life, and he wants it in an interrupted way. And Jesus, to Pilate, provides nothing for him. Jesus is no God to Pilate. At least not how Pilate would assume any God that he has ever read about would behave. And yet, the Son of God is standing before him, and he can't see him. And it's fascinating to me that the Sanhedrin's charge against Jesus is actually what they're creating. They're on the verge of creating a riot by trying to get Jesus to not create a riot, which I think is kind of comical. So Jesus is passed on to Herod. Follow me with verse 6. But when Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. When he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at that time. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time. because he had been hearing about it and was hoping to see some sign performed by Jesus. And he questioned him at some length, but Jesus answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there, accusing him vehemently. And Herod with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for they had been enemies with each other before that. Just a bit of background on Herod, what we've learned from the book of Luke. Herod, first of all, is mentioned in chapter 3 of Luke as being the tetrarch of Galilee. Remember, there were 3 brothers that were essentially ruling different aspects of Israel. And Herod is the tetrarch of Galilee, where Jesus has spent the bulk of his ministry. He's also the one that imprisoned Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, and had him beheaded. By chapter 9, when it says that Herod wanted to see Jesus, we know at that point it wasn't just to shake his hand. By chapter 13 in Luke makes it very clear that Herod is searching for Jesus to destroy him. Herod was likely staying at an old Hasmonean palace just at the foot of the Temple Mount. Go to the next slide, will you? You see the Temple Mount again, just down to the bottom right. You see I've kind of circled that you see the 2-pronged kind of building. Go to the next slide. This is kind of a closer look. This Hasmonean palace nestled right up next to what would now be called the Western Wall of Jerusalem. And there's like Pilate and Jesus, there's quite a contrast between Jesus and Herod. 3 times in verse 8, if you'll notice, Luke mentions Herod wanted to see Jesus. I think that's fascinating. We find out in chapter 9 he wanted to see Jesus. We found out in chapter 13 he wanted to see Jesus. And 3 times in verse 8, Luke presses this point. Herod wants to see Jesus. It makes you wonder, what is it that Herod is looking for? What did Herod want to see? Jesus, the Messiah and King, is literally standing in front of him, and he can't see a thing. To me, this is really scary. And I wonder if sometimes this isn't a little more common with us than we think. I wonder if maybe our incorrect insistence on who God is supposed to be in our lives causes us to somehow miss him when he's actually standing right in front of us. I think a lot of times we have in our mind made up, this is what God is like. And then when the trials and the life turns, like Brian talked about before I came up, and it doesn't match what we're going through, we're in a quandary. I was having this great conversation with my daughter just a couple weeks ago. Jeff Clipness gave her a read through the Bible in 1 year kind of deal. She's a junior down at Cal Poly. And she's really been diligent. She's all excited. She's 2 months into this. Every day she's read her daily reading, although she said, man, Dad, it's really slowing down in Leviticus. I don't know if I can do this. It's just cute. I said, you can cheat a little. That's okay. I mean, you're washed by the blood of Christ. Cheating is not too bad. You have to skip something. Just don't derail yourself. No, I can do this. I can get through the Torah. So she's been doing this every day. And she read something. Forgive me, I don't recall the story, but she read something about God doing something. I think he wiped some people out off the earth and this and that. And she said, I have a question. I said, what? She said, God doesn't do this. And I said to her, you just read that he does. And she said, yeah, but God's not like that. And I said, well, sweetheart, you have a real problem on your hands then, don't you? Because the God that you've created in your mind is not matching the God of the sacred text. It's exactly what Jesus was saying to his disciples at the feeding of the 5,000. You have eyes, but you do not see. You have ears, but you cannot hear. I think this happens because we want God explainable to us. We tidy God up and we convince ourselves, God is in a box, but I made the box really big. And we all convince ourselves that this is God. We say things like, this is always one of my favorite ones, we say things like God is sovereign. And the church has defined this as that God is in control. And yet we look around ourselves and we see chaos all over the place. marriages crumbling, kids going wayward, and parents not knowing what to do, jobs being lost, bills not being able to be paid, tension, death, dying, decay, and we don't know what to do with this. And we cling to this idea that God is in control, but we see chaos all around, and we don't know how to clasp just that single concept of who is God and what do I do with that. We have eyes that do not see, and we have ears that do not hear. Pilate can't see how Jesus can help him get further along in his life. He simply wants his life to work for him. Jesus does not look like any God he understands, and yet he stands before him. Herod wants a God display. He wants him to show himself in a sign, or at least what he thinks that should look like. And what he gets from the Son of God is silence, which I think is humorous. And Luke reminds us who was pulling the string in verse 10 when he says, the whole of the Sanhedrin was standing there accusing him vehemently. And you can tell how low this gets because Herod steps down off his throne and actually gets to the level of Jesus. He stoops to the level of Jesus, if you will, and joins in his guards in this mocking procession. Join in hostility now, the friends, Herod and Pilate, in hostility against Jesus and God the Father. Verse 13. Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers, being the Sanhedrin, and the people. And he said to them, you brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. No, nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us, and behold, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. Therefore I will punish him and release him. We have this opposing sides now. Pilate and the Sanhedrin wrestling back and forth. And Pilate calls together almost a sort of a town meeting. And for the first time in the arrest and the trials, it says that the people were present. What's fascinating is it really doesn't say who they are or how many they are. I always, you watch the movies, you always think it's like all of Jerusalem turned against Jesus. And I don't think that's accurate at all. I think the movies really have it wrong. It doesn't make sense. The people start coming on Sunday, and every day, for 4 straight days, they come to the temple, and they're blown away by how sharp Jesus is. They love his teaching, the general public does. When Jesus is carrying the cross through the streets, right? And what happens? The women are falling before him and crying on his behalf. So really, I think what's taking place is, I think the majority of the general public thinks he's an amazing prophet. So who it is that's joined the Sanhedrin, I'm not sure. Maybe in the hundreds. Surely not in the tens of thousands. And with all these people present, Pilate can now test the will of the people. And remember, Pilate's goal is just calm. All he wants is his life back. Verse 17. Now he was obliged to release to them at the feast one prisoner. But they cried out together, saying, away with this man and release for us Barabbas. He was one who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection made in the city of Jerusalem and for murder. Pilate wanted to release Jesus, address them again, but they kept on calling out, saying, crucify him. Crucify him. And there's also something in this text that Luke does not want us to miss about this Messiah. He is absolutely innocent. It's amazing how clear he makes this. Even the flogging is not a presumption of guilt. It was simply to appease the people. The flogging was these leather straps off of a rod on which were tied either jagged bones or pieces of iron. And the goal wasn't to whip the person. The goal was to throw the whip around so the strands of leather encircled the body, and then it was to pull so that they tore as they were circling, coming back off. Isn't it crazy? That insane. This is not because he's innocent. Pilate is just trying to get the people to leave him alone so he can have his life back. He's appeasing a bunch of people, by the way, by beating a man to an inch of his life, and they hate him anyway. which I think is the insanity of all this. And Luke drives this point of his innocence home in a couple ways. First of all, he does it through absolutely sheer repetition of these verses. The repetition of this is just glaring. 5 times it mentions Pilate tried to release Jesus. He's innocent. 2 times it says he cannot find fault in Jesus because he's innocent. 4 times the verb to find is used, finding nothing with Jesus because the Son of Man is innocent. He's innocent, but he does not look like God. He also makes it clear in the contrast. Jesus is repeatedly declared innocent versus this Barabbas guy who is mentioned 2 times as being an insurrectionist and a murderer. And this isn't just some common criminal. This is a guy who's leading a movement, a political movement against Rome. And so he's actually trying to create civil unrest. And so this guy is actually worthy of crucifixion. In Peter's speech in chapter 3 in the book of the Acts of the Apostles, he says this: "The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, has glorified his servant Jesus, the one whom you delivered and disowned in the presence of Pilate, when he had declined to release him. But you disowned the holy and righteous one, and asked for a murderer to be granted to you." Jesus, the Son of God, is the righteous one who suffers on behalf of humanity. Jesus, the Son of God, is the one who is vindicated as innocent in his resurrection. The question is, do we have eyes to see and ears to hear him? Or do we stay so committed to what we want God to be to us that we miss him when he literally stands right in front of us every day? This is going to be maybe a huge shock to you. But I feel it's my need to help you come to a reality I have come to. Every single one of us has a misperception of God. Do you believe that? Do you believe that? Every single person in this room has God incorrect in some way or another. You know, for a long time I came to church, and in my arrogance I came listening to see what didn't agree with what I already thought. It's a horrible way to come to church. You may be like that. I did it for a long, long time. David Eckman became my pastor. When I was in my 20s, I didn't let David disciple me because I just didn't think he really had a lot to teach me. And I look back at that now and I just go, wow, you're an idiot. Every one of us, when we meet God face to face, I think will be in awe at some of the things we see. The question is, do we know that? We desire to know God deeply, but we have to lay down the assumptions that we're always right about who he is. When the sacred text delivers to us, like he was to my daughter, a different God than the one we're clinging to, we have to let go of our idolatrous view of God. It's just idolatrous. And let the God of the Word pour over us and say, even though you make me uncomfortable, you're the one I will cling to. I want to cling to the God of reality, not of my reality. Does that make sense? When we come to the Word on Sunday, during the week, when you read the Word, come with the question every time, God, do I have you wrong? Because it will make me interpret life incorrectly. When junk hits, you will incorrectly label God. When things are confusing, when God doesn't seem to step in and help, when God can't further you in your situation, you will cling to the wrong God. We will be like Pilate and Herod, where the Son of God stands literally before us and we miss him because he's not turning out to be what we wanted him to be. We have to cast aside these silly, stubborn assumptions about God. Here God stands innocent, but he's silent. The only one with real authority in this entire situation and He's doing nothing to stop us. Is that what God does? Sometimes. And having every answer to every question, Jesus refuses to open His mouth. Does God do that sometimes? Apparently so. Jeremiah 5:21 says this, "Now hear this, O foolish and senseless people, who have eyes but do not see, who have ears but do not hear. Such are those who are unwilling to take Jesus as He presents Himself." The life and death of Jesus present God to you and I. The question is, what do we see?